Good morning, Team Alabama. We are ready for more of the Lottery Rose. We are on Chapter 10. Please find it on your Chromebook and read along with me. Chapter 10 in the Lottery Rose. When Georgie spent time with Robin these days, he had many hours in which to watch old Eddie at work in the garden. Robin could be kept quiet there, happily pounding nail after nail into a piece of wood, and Georgie, taking advantage of such times, paid close attention to every task the old gardener performed. Sometimes he longed to help, but old Eddie was not happy with boys being what he called underfoot. And so Georgie only watched him from a distance. One day, however, Mr. Collier made a suggestion. "Would you like to help in the garden now and then, Georgie? Maybe it would be a good thing for you to learn more about taking care of the flowers since you like them so much." Georgie's face showed his eagerness, but a second later he shook his head. "What about Robin? I couldn't keep an eye on him. I think that either Amanda or I can keep an eye on Robin more often, and you can romp with him once in a while and take him down to the lake. But as I said before, you should be doing other things too." Old Eddie was not greatly pleased at first by the idea of having Georgie for a helper, and Georgie heard him growl at Mr. Collier as they talked together. "Ain't Sister Mary Angela supposed to keep them kids corralled on the other side of the street?" he said in a mad voice. And then he shrugged and replied to something that Mr. Collier said. "Well then, if Mrs. wants to turn a kid loose in her garden, I hope she knows what it is she's doing." In less than a week, however, old Eddie and Georgie were working together as if the difference between someone who was almost 8 and someone who was 70 had nothing to do with their respect for one another. Georgie, without thinking about it, began to take up some of old Eddie's movements, shoulders rounded with head leaning down, a slow shuffling walk in which the front of each foot was thrust forward into the soil at every step. They didn't talk much, but they soon shared a recognition of what needed to be done and why and when. They drove together into town at intervals, and old Eddie came to depend upon Georgie's memory of what materials were needed for the garden's growth. Mrs. Harper worked as usual among her favorite flowers, but she kept at some distance from Georgie, seeming never to notice his presence in the garden. One day, however, she spoke to him. And that was the day that old Eddie was angered at the behavior of his young helper. Mrs. Harper was on her way to the tool house after working among the azalea beds. Passing a short distance from old Eddie and Georgie, she stopped to inspect the edging that Georgie had done along one of the flagstone paths. She called out cheerfully, "Nice job you've done here, Georgie, thank you." Georgie didn't so much as mumble a reply, and old Eddie was outraged. "Missus only wanted to give you a polite word of thanks," he told Georgie sharply. "Just a polite thank you for something that you'd done to please her. And what did you do? You clammed up and walked away like a loony. That's what you done. If I had the right, I'd give you a good smacking for your insolence." Georgie had nothing to say to old Eddie either. He carefully raked beneath the hedgerow where he was working and filled the big wheelbarrow time after time, hauling the debris off to the barrels back of the tool house. You might add debris to your vocab list. That's like trash. After that, he silently reproached Mrs. Harper by picking up the recently sharpened pruning shears that she had left lying in the grass the evening before, oiling them and hanging them in their proper place on the wall of the tool shed. "Missus is careless, that she is," old Eddie had told Georgie on other occasions. "A body that neglects good tools never makes an A1 gardener." He and Georgie glanced at one another often and shook their heads when they found garden tools that Mrs. Harper had left overnight in the wet grass. But this day old Eddie had no praise for Georgie's care of the neglected tools. He kept a severe silence, and when Georgie announced that he had finished his work for the day, old Eddie didn't even bother to glance at him. Georgie meditated for a long time in the soft shade of the royal ponciana tree before he approached his rose bush, and he walked over to sit beside it, heavy-hearted and confused at the war of feelings inside him. For a long while Georgie sat silently, touching its leaves from time to time, but not daring to say anything to his friend. A curious sparrow stopped to look at the new buds just coming out on the bush, and its weight set Georgie's rose swaying over close to him. And when the leaves stirred with the swaying, Georgie was almost sure he heard the bush say, "That was a bad thing you done, Georgie." He sat quietly, listening to all the garden sounds around him. He thought the bush was probably thinking of Mrs. Harper and saying it to himself, that she was a nice lady and very pretty. "I say she's mean and ugly," he said sullenly. "I don't care what you think, or what old Eddie thinks either." The thought suddenly came to him that after all Mrs. Harper was Robin's mother, and that maybe Robin loved her. And for a moment he felt guilty, but that didn't last long. Like a flash, he got mad at himself for feeling that way, and then he got mad at the rose bush too, and at the world and everybody. Okay, so she's his mother. I hate mothers. You remember the one in Tampa, don't you? Well, I hate her, and I hate Robin's mother too. He paused as a thought occurred to him. "Only she's not really Robin's mother," she whispered. "There are some things around here that you don't know yet." But the rose bush didn't seem at all interested in what Georgie had to say. Georgie was not to be put down, however. "You remember the mean fairy in the story that Robin's grandfather read to me when I first started learning?" he asked. "The one that said, 'I'm mad because you didn't invite me, so now your child will die.' And the other fairy said, 'Now just hold on a minute. She's not either going to die. She simply will go to sleep for 100 years. You remember that story?" Several roses nodded in the wind, and Georgie knew the bush was listening closely. Okay, I want to ask you a question. How does Georgie treat his rose bush? Why don't you add that as a fact? Georgie treats his rose bush, and then add your thoughts. Bottom of page 127. "Well, I'll tell you something," he said. "She stole Robin when he was a baby, and she said, 'I'm mad, so I put a curse on you, and she'll never learn to talk more than a few words, and you won't learn to read or nothing.'" He heard the rose bush sigh. It was the way that Sister Mary Angela sighed sometimes when she talked to him about forgiving Mrs. Harper. "I suppose you think I'm lying," he muttered. There was no answer, and he sat for a long time watching a butterfly trying to make up its mind about something or other as it dashed from one flower to another and circled above a spray of water that had been set to give a bed of tired azaleas a drink, and finally settled on a blade of grass a few inches from Georgie's toes. He watched the slow lift and lowering of the bright wings, smiling to himself. "Yesterday I learned Robin to say butterfly when we saw one on our walk. His grandfather couldn't understand him, but I could. I said, 'He's saying butterfly.' And Mr. Collier told me that I understand Robin better than anybody." He was silent for a while, thinking to himself about his plans for Robin, but finally he had to tell some of them to his friend. "I'm going to keep trying till I can learn Robin to talk better. He can say some words real clear already, and after that I'll learn him to read the way that Mr. Collier learned me." He felt something getting tight in his throat while he was speaking, and finally he said, "I know you don't believe me. You think I can't ever learn Robin to talk, except for maybe a few words. You think that I'll never learn him to read at all?" He rose, and he got ready to leave. "Well, you'll see," he said stubbornly, but the tightness still held on in his throat. Okay, we're stopping there today. You have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama. Before we leave, why don't you put one or two more facts on your list of facts today? Have a great rest of your day.